Greetings and welcome to our fourth episode of Trade and Taxes, an initiative between SNG Grant Thornton and UJ Business School. Today we are unpacking the budget further. We've had an episode where we talked about the economy, talked about where we are as a country and what we need to do for us to get things right. So we talked about investing in the right places, investing a lot more in education, in logistics, and some key sectors of the economy. Today, what we will be talking about, or right now, what we're talking about is the taxes, the increase in VAT or proposed increase in VAT, and the income tax brackets for individuals, and unpacking further what that means to the economy. So what does it mean to disposable income for the middle class, for the high earners, and for the low income earners? And I'm also particularly interested to understand, how do we define those classes in South Africa? I'm sure many of you are as well. If you have any questions or follow-ups, please follow us on some of the social media accounts that should be appearing on the screen right now. So we'll start off with some introductions. My name is Kainta Ngongandu. I head up the tax department again. So I will hand over to you, Prof. Just introduce yourself.
Good day, everyone. Thank you very much. My name is Frederick Kersen. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Economics.
Okay, great. Thanks, Frederick.
My name is Mabuto Mtembu, Associate Director at SNG Grant Thornton, specializing in indirect taxes. Thank you.
Okay, Prof, we'll start with you. So the minister, first time around, on the budget that was canned, that he did not read out, was initially going to increase the VAT from 15% to 17%. So now the proposal has been, first off, start with 0.5% increase, and then we'll see how that goes, and there may be a further increase next year. So your thoughts on that, and how that may impact the different classes within the economy?
Thank you very much. Yes, I think one thing to just think about with this budget is to put it in context with South Africa, with the trifecta of issues. We really don't have a lot of space to tax more. I think a lot of South Africans are taxed above and beyond what they can, actually. And then also we have a limit in terms of where we can cut spending, but also we can't borrow. So that's a trifecta of issues. And that just puts the context of this current budget. And the 2% was just too much for South Africans. Then they revised that down to the 0.5. And I think most analysts would agree that a 0.5 is doable if economic growth then increases. And I think that is so important. But I think in terms of the markets, I think everybody expected some sort of tax increase. It's just where it was. And I think this VAT increase was the only place we could actually go and get that money to really plan or implement our plans for economic growth. But I think for in terms of the classes, just to think about it, but the lower class, we know have zero-rated products. They're zero-rated products which are protected from the VAT. They've expanded that list, so that again helps protect the poor in terms of the VAT increase. But again, studies have shown that that is not always the case, and the poor still suffers from a VAT increase, but it's mainly the middle class. Because once you move from, let's say, a lower income group to a middle class lifestyle or lifestyle where you want to start spending more money on things in your life, you want to increase your lifestyle, then you start buying the products which are not part of the zero-rated product list. And those ones are then included in the VAT, and those are the ones which then start harming the consumers. Because if you think about it from a higher income group, yes, they do buy a lot, they spend a lot in the economy, but still the impact of that is not as much, because VAT is a regressive tax, meaning as your income goes up, the impact of that is less on your budget. So it's more in the middle class where the spending, where there's tight budgets, people have a lot of debt, so they're living on very tight budgets, where the VAT increase can have a significant impact on their spending patterns and then have a negative impact on economic growth, which is some of the perceptions in the analysts of why a VAT increase can be harmful to the economy. But given the context of this budget, it was needed, given we have that issue of we don't have any more spending power, we need more money to spend, we have our plans to increase economic growth, but we can't borrow anymore. And that was, I think, the biggest issue.
All right. Thank you. So I think before we come to you, Mabuto, on the fact that, so we do have problems, we needed to get additional funding. So taxes have to be increased. So the government has gone with that. There has been a lot of conversations or chatter about why not increase corporate income tax? Why not introduce wealth tax? So from a tax perspective, my view, even prior to those conversations, has been the increasing income tax, corporate income tax, does not naturally result in you getting additional resources, because that depends, one, on the economy growing. The companies that you want to increase the taxes on, they need to be profitable. We've got a lot of companies that are still recovering from COVID, who have huge losses that they're carrying forward from those years. So even if they are making profits right now, before you calculate the tax and apply that higher corporate income tax rate, you would need to set off at least some of the losses, up to 80%, from the recent changes in legislation on that front. But there is a still strong view for mainly politicians that, well, you can do it, and that is where you get your money. And then on the other end, there is the strong view again that says, well, increase wealth tax. Some people say, well, we do have some forms of wealth tax already in South Africa. If you're buying properties, there's transfer duties, there is tax on dividends, and if you are leaving your assets to your kids, there would be taxes on that as well. And some people then group that in within the wealth taxes. So what would be your view on what else, what other taxes could the government increase if they did not want to increase VAT?
Yeah, so that's a difficult question, I think, especially about what different taxes you can actually increase. I think, like I said, South Africa is one of the most taxed societies in the world, and I think that is something to consider. So even a wealth tax, although it will bring in money, again, with a society that is overtaxed, I think it was, again, the basic question is, do we tax the producers or the consumers? Do we put a burden on the consumers or the producers? If we go with the company tax, you might put more burden on the producers, and that can also disincentivize private investment and foreign investment, which again is one of the big drivers of growth for South Africa. I mean, one of our big things we aim to grow the economy is with the private-public partnership, and that is via attracting foreign investment. So you need to have an environment where they feel this is where I can make money. So company tax is probably one of the reasons why they didn't touch it. The VAT was the one place where they felt, okay, this is a minimal impact, where we spread the cost throughout society, throughout all the consumers, and we try to protect the poor. And then we try to incentivize people to say, but this is a growth budget, meaning we do have the policies in place. Trust us, these are the policies here. And there are policies there that will say, listen, we are growing the economy. We are going to invest in infrastructure, energy, water, all of that, transport. And that is, I think, what most South Africans will think about. But in terms of other taxes, that's sometimes difficult because they did increase the sin tax. But again, the sin tax, if you think about it, has a lot of, it's relatively inelastic, meaning if you increase the sin tax, you open the doors again for illegal trade, where people then start, because they're not going to decrease their consumption of those goods. They're dependent on it. So their consumption of those goods are inelastic. So meaning they would then go and find alternative ways. And then illegal trade in alcohol and so on gets opened up again. And I think that is where you can't just overtax the sin tax. You need to think about, so it's all a balancing scale. And I think for the government, the VAT was the one place where they're going to get the most money with the least amount of impact on society. But again, the public's perception is a VAT is always a strong public perception as a very bad thing. And the general public understands VAT, so they don't want a VAT increase. And that is where the government is, why they reduced it probably from 2% to 0.5%, because the 0.5% also sounds a bit easier to take than a 2%. And it does bring in less money. And the minister said, listen, because it's taking less money in from going from a 2 to 0.5, now we have to reduce some of the other things that we wanted to spend on.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. Mabuto, your take, overall budget and VAT increase. And I'd like to hear your views on the impact of the VAT increase on the poor and the zero rating. If that does cushion, I know Frederick did touch on that and say it does not always trickle down to the consumer. Just your take.
No, thank you very much, Kanyisa. I think my perspective is that in the initial budget, there was a huge outcry on the impact of the 2% or the 2 basis point increase, which effectively was going to be about 33%, right, in real terms. And the huge outcry was on the impact of that on the most vulnerable households, mainly people who are dependent on social grants. And I think there was a missed opportunity there to, in fact, perform an analysis of what impact the 2% would have had on those who are already taxpayers, mainly the middle class. And the government, I think, was smart, right, in their discussions, because the middle class didn't complain as much as, or rather, whoever represents or has an opportunity to be in the public discourse. Mainly the talk was around, the most vulnerable households. And if you look at how then the government had to restructure, yes, the 2%, in my view, with regards to the most vulnerable households, government indicated that they've increased the social grants, for instance, by above inflation. The average inflation in 2024 was about 4.4%, and there's VAT of about now 3%. So, in real terms, the increases in social grants will be offset by the VAT increase. So the poor will remain where they were before. I mean, that's the reality. Now, if you look at the middle class, the government had to then sort of determine which other areas, they would have to explore in order to still meet, the budgetary needs that they require in order to fund the expenditure. And they looked at the personal income tax. And interestingly, with the personal income tax, it was not projected as an increase in personal income tax, but as a non-adjustment of the tax brackets. Now, which effectively means that if the tax brackets are not adjusted, at least with inflation, certain taxpayers, about 6 million of taxpayers, as they get their salary increments in their areas of employment, they potentially will move to the, higher tax brackets, which effectively means they will be paying higher taxes. And I think the government indicated that they will raise about 19 billion rand from that, right? Yeah. That's the projected amount. So the missed opportunity to, in fact, put an emphasis that the middle class are already overburdened with tax. They're already overburdened with the cost of living, resulted in even now the government taking a tougher stance to overburden them now with personal income tax. Indirectly so, because it was not done directly. Yeah. So, and there is obviously another added disadvantage to the middle class, because as they move to the higher brackets, you now have also the general inflation, right, that they have to deal with, right? As you've mentioned earlier, the high cost of living, increases in, electricity prices, increases in food prices, etc., etc. So, so I think the government was smarter than everybody in restructuring its budget. And I think there should have been, a more vocal outcry initially about the middle class and the impact. And then you make mention of the zero rating of food items. I've said, look, the increases in social grants will be offset by the 0.5%, and then you will reach a point of equilibrium, right? And then the second thing is that I'm for the adoption of best practices globally, right? But in the South African context, I do not believe that the zero rating effect, in fact, cascades to the poorest of the poor. And the reason being, simply, is that we don't have a highly regulated, system, and in terms of how the prices are determined at different levels of the supply chain, right? So at the top level, yes, the government might be able to regulate and to monitor whether indeed, compliance is being adhered to. But at the lower level, the government does not have a system to regulate, because a person in the rural area would not travel to town to buy from Checkers. They would buy from a local shop. The local shop would have bought from a warehouse. They would obviously add their own margins. And of course, then the zero rating would then therefore not benefit the poor. That's my view.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Mabuto. So I want to just get your views on Mabuto's comments on the middle class, that there is in fact essentially a double whammy. There's an increase in VAT, and then there is essentially an increase in personal income taxes that they have to pay. And then there is, in other countries, there's certain services that people get from government, which in South African context, a lot of people do get some of those services, but not necessarily the middle class. So if we can just unpack overall what can we expect? Obviously, if the economy doesn't grow, you did say if the economy grows, then we're okay. If the economy does not grow, the middle class is paying more in all of these different areas. What will it do to the economy? So what should we then expect? What is coming for us in the next budget speech or during the medium term?
So I think that's very interesting. It's also raising the point that there was no representation for the middle class. In terms of the discussions, it was all about the vulnerable to society and in those opposing the wealth tax, meaning from the other end. So now it wasn't really about a middle class, but a middle class, and that is a theme that has been seen in policy lately with the missing middle in higher education, where once you fall above a cutoff point, you're not part of this anymore. So even though you're just above the cutoff point, you don't qualify anymore for the grants, the things that you need to, and you're just above it. So technically you're not really far away from poverty, but you are still not now, you're not included now in the policy discussions anymore, and you're not included in receiving those benefits. And I think in terms of this budget, the double impact it has had, I think again, the middle class is so fragile because again, debt levels are at record levels for the middle class, high cost of living, there's so much expenditure, and then there's an issue about policy about what is the middle class, because that's the thing. If you want to define the middle class, that's where it becomes a problem. But if you think about a middle class in its theoretical sense, the middle class is one of your strongest consumers. So what we see in the Asian economies and the emerging economies, we see a strong middle class that almost drives your economic growth, because these middle class households, they want to spend to get a better lifestyle. They want to take out loans to even spend more. So they have a strong sense of spending. Where they're wealthy, or those at the top percentile, they normally hoard money. They will take money, they would invest it, they won't spend it back in the economy. But a middle class is the strongest spender in the economy. So a strong spending middle class leads to economic growth and more businesses and everything. And the virtuous cycle of production and income goes on and on. But that's the 3% growth. So the 3% growth is tied to the middle class. But the problem now is, with all of this, if the middle class suffers and we don't grow, then the middle class is also normally the ones that understands it and they revolt against it. So they are the ones that will say, no, we don't accept this. So they are the ones, normally in history also, the middle class were the ones that can easily take a stance. You would think about university students that can take a stance against what has been done to them maybe in the past. So that's something to think about, is the middle class is one of your drivers of a democratic process. So that's also things to think about if you need to think about your middle class and protect them a bit more, because this budget really harms them and they have a voice and it will come to the fore. The only reason why they don't have a voice at these places is because there's no official definition of who they are. They're just a group in the middle between 8,000 and 40,000 a month. And it's a large group, but it's a vast range. If you think 8,000 Rand a month till 40,000 Rand a month is sometimes classified as middle class. There's various definitions. So that's a vast group that they don't share similar things. Like the vulnerable, they share similar things. They're all reliant on the social grant. So they have a similar cause. The wealthy has a similar cause. They want to protect their wealth. But a middle class, they're not really a collective. So they don't stand up as one voice, and then they sometimes get at these places, they get into that situation.
Yeah. All right. So that is a lot to consume. I asked you this earlier when we were outside, that if you earn 35,000 in your household, you stay in an area like Bryanston or Fourways, there aren't enough public schools there for your kids to go to. You probably are paying for your own security. In fact, even if you're earning about 50,000 per month, But I don't understand how once you earn above 40, essentially, you then considered wealthy, because in the South African context, where you must pay for everything, if you have 50K a month, once you cover some of your basics, you already you're struggling, which is why I suppose, like you indicated, then the middle class would be highly indebted. But it'll be interesting to see between if there is specific research, I don't know if it exists in the South African context, that focuses again within the middle class and get to understand that a bit better. And understanding, of course, at the back of it, that a lot of people have to pay for a lot of services that ordinarily would be provided by the government. So on the question of zero rating of specific items, so what has been defined as basic that is zero rated? What does it include? Does it cover all aspects of life? Is it basic stuff that people consume on a daily basis?
I think, in my view, the basket presupposes that humans only eat food, right? And the reality is that that is not the case, right? And humans must depend on certain type of food, right? Because that's what is in the basket. Initially, specific, like it has to be brown bread, it has to be, soya beans, etc., etc. I think they've included now pork. I did hear pork during the budget speech. I'm not sure whether chicken actually came through, but I know chicken, the unions were in fact pushing for chicken to be included in the basket. But the reality is that whether, how big that basket expands, one has to ensure that the zero rating does cascade to the intended beneficiaries of the zero rating provision. And if it doesn't, then the zero rating just becomes null and void. However, your question was around, do people just depend on what is in the basket? And the reality is that they don't just depend on what is in the basket. People have to have clothing, right? The people who are poor also do have kids, right? And, buying, items for kids is very expensive. So as much as the social grants for the kids may be there, are they sufficient to, ensure that, the kids are well taken care of and they are able to, to survive? Your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah. Same question. So specifically middle class before 30, 40, you have to buy clothes, you have kids, you have to buy formula. 5 years ago when I was buying formula, it was very expensive. So what does all of this, so in this conversation again of zero rating items, or at least if you're middle class, you would then get some benefit if it were, but does it cover enough basic stuff for people?
I think specifically with the basket, the big thing was for the government in terms of how much revenue they're going to sacrifice. Because once they zero rated and it gets implemented, then they lose revenue. And I think that was their thing. So that's why they stopped at certain products. And because you don't want to just put the zero rated on more products and then you start losing the revenue, because the whole point about a VAT is the revenue. So it was just protecting the lower income households. But again, like we said, it's not always that simple if the prices don't trickle down to that point. But a big thing about a middle class now is their spending patterns are there they want to expand, they want to buy more, they have to buy more, and they also have to pay for services that's normally provided in other countries for them. They have to pay for private security sometimes. They have to pay for private medical aid if they need to. They have to pay for services, and these services are also expensive. So now, once you get into that lifestyle, you take on debt just to keep the lifestyle, because one last thing that you want to sacrifice as a household is the lifestyle. You don't want to take your kids out of the school just because you can't afford it anymore, or if you need to take them to a private school, you want to try and do that. But again, you take on debt, but you work your budget out until the last cent. And that's why then these small changes have a big impact on your budget, because now all of a sudden these changes make sure that you feel like, how am I going to expand? How am I going to grow from this? Where am I going to get the money to actually pay for the VAT increase, to the income bracket change? And all of those burdens then make you feel a bit disheartened as a middle class household, because again, life is still expensive. And then we've covered it in one of the previous sessions, the geopolitical tensions. Inflation is still an issue that can arise in the future in South Africa, given the geopolitical trade wars happening. So again, that can further impact the middle class. So there's a lot of things, future uncertainty. And if you're from the vulnerable society, you rely on the social grant. So the fact that the social grant is there, you're happy. If you're from the higher income level, you have enough protection probably from your income to against any global shock. But if you're middle class and all of a sudden there's a financial crisis or there's something happening, then job losses are taken. Then that's because if a middle class household loses one job, then they fall straight back into poverty. That's what we call the vulnerable middle class. It's a certain group in the middle class. So once one person in the household loses a job, the whole household falls into poverty. And those are the system things. The only thing, again, in South Africa is there's various definitions of the middle class. So some people see it as between 8,000 to 29,000. Some people see it as between 20 to 40,000. Some people see it as 25,000. Anything below that, so that's where the official definition is not yet there. We have different definitions. But again, if you take a group from 8,000 Rand a month till 40,000, if that whole group is considered middle class, it's a vast number of households in South Africa that doesn't qualify for grants, but also is not strong enough to probably stay out of poverty if disaster hits and job losses hit.
So there's so much that we can spend hours unpacking. I am looking forward to having a lot more conversations with you on the class and the middle class going forward. Any closing remarks, Mabutho?
Yeah. So thanks, Kanyisa. I think 2 points that I would like to raise. The first one is that the government announced that there's been a debt relief revision for Eskom, which has resulted in an additional 20 billion saving for government. And I think I would like to see more of that. That's very positive for many of the parastatals where government has been spending enormous amount of money in bailing out parastatals. So I think we need to see more work being done in reducing spending from a government point of view on what we would term as wastage in the parastatals, which may obviously help then in future to alleviate increases in taxes, etc., etc. But my concern is that I didn't see a lot of emphasis in the budget on how the government aims, to reduce, to its spending, not on social programs, not on infrastructure, not on programs that are targeted at growing the economy, but on the wastage that is reported annually by the Auditor General at all spheres of government. I didn't see any mention of that, and for me, that is a concern. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mabutho.
Yes, I would just like to add, I think that is probably one of the biggest things in the budget, was just to see, we need to see more of where the government can stop wasteful spending, all of that. But I think if I was talking as a summary remark, I would say we shouldn't focus on the 0.5 VAT increase. We should focus on the 0.6, which is the economic growth rate currently. I think that is our main focus points. We need to get that 0.6% up. We're below most emerging economies, including Brazil, in terms of our economic growth rate. And I think that is where we should focus on. We've now taken the hit of an increase in VAT, and now it's almost like the last chance of this government, the GNU, probably to win back the trust of South Africans and show, listen, this is the growth rate, because at the moment the numbers are not speaking for them. The numbers need to speak for them. They need to achieve the growth rate, even in the difficult political situations. They need to go and find investors for the country, and they need to show South Africa, listen, we can grow. You've trusted us, and then the GNU will have a success. But I think this is the last chance for this GNU, probably for the general public, because they've taken out a chance of saying, we've increased the VAT, so now trust us, we will deliver the growth.
Great. Thank you so much to you both.